Who's fueling the fighting in Libya? The United Arab Emirates is accused of supplying fighters trying to seize Tripoli with anti-tank missiles made in the United States. So, how did US weapons end up in the hands of the warlord Khalifa Haftar, who's trying to overthrow the UN-recognized government? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Peter Dobby. It's a question being asked by Libya's internationally recognised government in Tripoli and in Washington too. How did US-made anti-tank missiles sold to the United Arab Emirates end up on the battlefield in Libya? The Libyan army, supporting the UN-recognised government, says boxes of the weapons stamped with UAE logos were found in Gharyan. Troops recaptured the city on Wednesday, 3 months after the warlord Khalifa Haftar took control there, trying to use it as a springboard for his campaign to seize the capital. Haftar has the support of regional powers, including Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis. The weapons find raises questions about whether the UAE is violating internationally recognized US arms sales agreements and the UN arms embargo on Libya.
The seized weapons and ammunitions have been sent to the specialized experts and have been documented. The military commanders and the political leaders are now fully aware of these weapons and ammunitions to make the right decisions that will be announced.
Well, our Libya correspondent Mahmoud Abdel Wahed in Tripoli sets up our discussion.
As they recaptured the strategic town of Gharyan from Haftar's forces, forces loyal to Libya's UN-backed government of national accord announced that they captured a number of anti-tanks rockets, Javelin, ATGM, sophisticated, advanced US-made anti-tanks rockets. Now, the military sources with the government of national accord say that they have assigned a team of experts to check and document these weapons and also to arrange a report to be submitted to the concerned international institutions, possibly in the United Nations. Meanwhile, officials at the Pentagon, the US Department of Defense, say that they're aware of these reports, but meanwhile, they're investigating and demanding additional information. We know that Libya is under arms embargo since 2011, but the UN-backed government of national accord says it's the only Libyan institution entitled to import weapons in coordination with the UN Security Council. But the United Arab Emirates, which is accused of supplying Haftar with those anti-tanks, Javelin, AGTM anti-tanks rockets, has been providing Haftar with weapons, drones, and also fighter jets since 2014. This could possibly be a violation of the sales agreement between the United Arab Emirates and the United States. But the question now is whether or not the United States is going to take an action against the United Arab Emirates, given the fact that there are mutual interests between the two countries. Mahmoud Abdul Wahed for Inside Story, Tripoli.
We have a panel. Let's bring them in. Joining us from Tripoli, Salah Al-Bakoush, a former senior advisor to the negotiating team of the High Council of States. From London, Andrew Smith, spokesman for the campaign against the arms trade. And from Washington, Lawrence Korb, formerly a US Assistant Secretary of Defense. Welcome to you all. Salah Al-Bakoush in Tripoli. There are inbuilt guarantees here. Why are they not working?
The guarantees in the end-user certificate have no enforcement mechanism, and that's probably one of the biggest reasons for their failure. I mean, their failure is not new. Their failure was apparent in the Yemeni conflict, where US arms and French arms ended up in the hands of groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda and ISIS and with the Houthis themselves. So this is not new. I think historically these guarantees did not work in the 1936 to 1939 Spanish Civil War, where German arms ended up on both sides through Greece.
Andrew Smith in London, specifically about these weapons that have ended up in Libya. They are logoed, they are branded with the UAE logo on them. How did these weapons get from a production line in the United States to Libya?
The main point is that there's no such thing as arms control once arms enter a war zone. In fact, there's very little control over arms once they leave our shores, particularly small arms. There's no way of knowing who a weapon will ultimately end up with and who it will ultimately be used against. So I think the key point here is that for all the end user certificates and for all the so-called guarantees which can be issued, they are actually largely very meaningless, and that by pouring weapons into war zones, by selling weapons to despotic regimes, by selling weapons to regimes with very poor stability or very poor human rights records, we don't know where we're ultimately going to end up. We could be feeling human rights abuses and wars for years and years to come.
Lawrence Korb in Washington, they were originally sold, we understand, to the United Arab Emirates. Were they sold in the knowledge that they would then go on to another country?
No, not at the time under the Obama administration. In fact, it's against the U.S. law for weapons we sell to one country to go to another without U.S. permission. What's different here, unlike what's happening in Yemen, a lot of times the weapons we supply to the UAE and the Saudis, which we knew were being used, were actually captured on the battlefield by Houthis or groups allied to them. This time it looks like the UAE just gave them right to General Haftar in violation not only of U.S. policy, but UN policy.
Salah al-Bakush in Tripoli, there are now, we understand, we are at the beginnings of multiple investigations. That's fine and dandy. What are the chances that Khalifa Haftar gives those investigating officials chapter and verse on where he got the weapons, who supplied them to him, and how much money he gave them to get them?
Nothing. He's not going to give any cooperation. He's not give any cooperation to the International Criminal Court. He thinks he has enough political support from the French and the Russians, the Emiratis, Saudis, and the Egyptians to get away with this stuff. He hasn't handed over somebody that's wanted by the International Criminal Court, and I think these weapons are representative of the UAE doubling down in its support of Haftar and thinking that they can get away with it based on the fact that the US or the Trump administration needs its cooperation, and the Saudis and the Egyptians, in implementing the deal of the century.
Andrew, is it possible to tighten end-use legislation?
The main thing which has to happen is a far stricter policy regarding who arms are sold to. Like, ultimately, we want to live in a world where nobody is selling weapons to anybody and people aren't going to war. Now, obviously, that's not going to happen in the short term, but certainly in the short term, what we should be looking at is much tighter regulations and controls over where these weapons are sold. What is the character of regime they're being sold to? What is the political situation they're being sold to? At the moment, so many different arms from so many different providers are going into a region which is already very tense in the Middle East. I don't believe that pouring more weapons into it is going to make that any less so. And looking at the character of the Emirati regime, it's a particularly despotic regime. But so are many of the regimes in the region who are being armed and supported. There isn't the incentive for cooperation because at the moment, there's almost certainly going to be a steady stream of black market weapons going in, as well as weapons which are being seized.
Lawrence, in Washington, would it be fair to say that so many countries are kind of half adopting the moral high ground on this as an issue? Because as an issue globally, it is getting traction, and yet they're saying one thing and doing something completely different.
Well, I think what happened here, we'll find out when all is said and done, is the fact that President Trump has leaned toward General Haftar. In fact, he had a conversation with him. I think that's what the UAE thought, well, he's not going to get upset. The remedy in the United States is what the Congress has just done for the Saudis, which is to prevent the arms sales. Now, President Trump could declare an emergency and do it anyway, but I think over time, opposition to these sales, particularly to the Saudis and the UAE, is really building in the in the United States. And the other thing that is important to keep in mind is once you sell them, you really don't have control anymore. What you can do is not sell them to that country again if they do what the UAE appears to have done here.
Andrew, should the world really be so very, very surprised here? I mean, the UAE played a significant role in the events surrounding what happened in the skies above and the land surrounding Benghazi back in 2017.
I don't think that people should be surprised. I agree entirely with what Lawrence just said about the growing opposition to these arms sales within the US. I think the fact that Senate and Congress have taken a line against arms sales to Saudi Arabia and support for the Saudi regime in the war in Yemen is historic, and it's very important. But it's also the case that these weapons should never have been sold in the first place. The Saudi regime, the Emirati regime, they had appalling characters before the war in Yemen. They have appalling characters now. But they've always been despots and dictatorships, and they should not have been receiving weapons in the first place.
Specifically with reference, Salah al-Bakush, to Khalifa Haftar, would this have happened with this weaponry that's got to him via the UAE if Donald Trump hadn't made a phone call last April? We've already touched on this, but last April there was a phone call where the perception for Khalifa Haftar was Donald Trump is edging towards endorsing me.
Well, they made a big brouhaha about it in Libya, the phone call. They advertised it all over all their communication channels as an indication of the U.S. support for Khalifa Haftar. The Emiratis probably thought so. That's if we assume that they delivered these weapons after the phone call. But the Emirati support is not new to Khalifa Haftar. They have built an air base near Benghazi. They've been delivering arms to Haftar since 2014. So this will continue. And I think the Emiratis basically think they can get away with it. And they have gotten away with it for a long time, not only in Libya, but in Yemen and other parts of the world.
Lawrence, in Washington, so many countries, so many people who buy these weapons now seem to, just more recently than the timescale that Salah is referring to, they seem perfectly comfortable with breaching the guidelines, with breaching the restrictions. So has anything shifted or changed within that calculation that those people are making?
Well, no, in fact, it's gotten worse because President Trump has bragged about the arms sales that he sells to countries in the region. He's made this a centerpiece of his foreign policy. And every time the Congress says, well, wait a second, those weapons are ending up in the wrong hands, he'll say, no, I'm creating a lot of jobs here in the United States. It's what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial congressional complex. The fact of the matter is these do create jobs. American arms trade is about half of the whole world's arms trade. And so when you have a president who embraces it, these countries feel, even if we violate this, we're still going to be able to buy them because the president is so concerned about American jobs. And unfortunately, most people in this country are not paying attention to what's happening in Libya or Yemen. Right now, the focus is on the whole question of Iran.
We'll come on to Iran in just a second, perhaps. But Andrew, picking up on that point from Lawrence, is it a help or a hindrance when the relatively new as he was when he said this, Donald Trump, US president, talks about the beautiful weapons that the United States makes? And also, to pick up on that percentage that Lawrence was using, 50%, I think I'm right in saying, Lawrence, 50% of the US arms sales go to specifically the Middle East.
It's not helpful when Donald Trump takes that tone, but Donald Trump is a particularly appalling frontman in that sense. But the foreign policy he's following regarding arms sales doesn't feel distinctly different from that of his predecessors. Under the Obama administration, under Bush, under Clinton, the US government was by far the largest arms dealer anywhere in the world. And there was no shortage of dictatorships and human rights abusing regimes that it was continuously arming and supporting. Donald Trump might be more obvious and his rhetoric might be more distasteful and his commitment to freedom and human rights might be slightly lesser, but all of these presidents have followed actually very similar sorts of policies, and the end results have seen US political and military support for human rights abusing regimes and dictatorships across the world for decades. It just so happens that Donald Trump is even more overt and open about it.
But Salah, just to be clear, Salah al-Bakoush in Tripoli, these weapons that we're talking about, the branded UAE weapons, they are also being described online as being game changers. Does that make this more important, more significant, and therefore more of a worry? Because if these people carry on getting their hands on these weapons, it means the conflicts never end. That means more people die.
Of course, I mean, introduction of such weapons will invite introduction of more weapons by the other side. These weapons, the Haftar forces were using Kornet armor rockets, and now they have the Javelin. So this will increase the pressure on other forces to increase their weapons, and weapons are plenty around the world, and there are merchants that will be very happy to supply as long as you have money, and Libyans, both sides, have the money. So this is a very dangerous situation, and we don't see any political moves on the part of the US or the Europeans to do anything about it, since the Emiratis and the Saudis and the Egyptians are needed in the larger scheme of things in the Middle East.
Andrew Smith in London, is this a double-edged sword, if you will, when it comes to culpability? I mean, the Saudis use cluster munitions. They're banned. In Syria, we've seen chemical weapons being used as well. Of course, they are banned. I'm going to read from an Amnesty report from February of this year. Amnesty saying the following states have recently supplied the Emiratis with arms: Australia, Belgium, Brazil, Bulgaria, France, Finland, Germany, South Korea, Turkey, the UK, and, of course, the United States. I could go on. The list is longer. We don't have time to list all the countries involved. So those awkward questions will just be ignored, or will somebody deal with it sooner or later?
What you've underlined with the list is the need for strong multilateral action, because the arms industry is a global industry. Its impacts are felt globally, and sellers exist all across the world. In fact, many of the weapons which leave a country like the UK will have components which are made in other countries as well. So there's definitely a multilateral global need for multilateral global solutions and regulations. But that doesn't, on the other hand, abdicate individual nation states of their responsibility. And when we look to the US, it's played a particularly strong role in arming the world for decades and decades. When we look to Russia, it's been doing the same, with a particular increase over recent years. When we look at other countries around Europe, they're doing much the same. But in reality, an equally long list published by Amnesty was a list which we published in 2015 of countries who had produced weapons which had been seized by ISIS. And it wasn't that ISIS had bought these weapons directly from France and the UK and other European countries. It was because they had seized them in the battlefield for the large part. But that is the point. When we sell these weapons, the lifespan of a weapon is very often longer than the lifespan of a government, and will almost always be longer than the lifespan of the political situation it's sold into. Political contexts change, but weapons can change hands, and they can do a great deal of damage.
Lawrence Corbyn, Washington, is there another imperative here? We're talking clearly about Libya, but no matter where the proxy conflict is taking place, weapons as currency, because if you're the guy that sells arms, the quid pro quo is you are buying loyalty from the person you are selling those arms to. So whether it's the USA to the UAE and then from the UAE to Libya, there's a chain reaction of loyalty there.
Well, there's no doubt about it. And what happens is that these countries will say to us, well, if you won't sell them to us, we'll buy them from the Russians or the Chinese. Just recently, we found out the Saudis are getting, ballistic missile technology from the Chinese. And the other point that we need to make is, with those very sophisticated American weapons end up in the wrong hands, countries like the Russians will be able to negate our strength in Europe, or in China in the Pacific. So not only is it a human catastrophe, but it basically is a national security catastrophe. We know that a lot of the weapons that ended up in the hands of the Houthis, that technology went back to Iran. And so that basically is a point that has to be made, because right now, unfortunately, people are focusing only on the economic dimension. And as my colleague said, it's got to be multilateral, because if the country says, well, if you won't buy them, we'll buy them from fill in country X, then in fact, you can't go ahead with this, and you can't stop this problem we've been just talking about.
Salah, is there another issue of culpability here or accountability? The purchasing countries, the middleman countries, in this case, allegedly the UAE, they never go to the original manufacturer/supplier with literally a blank sheet of paper, and they don't list off the countries they are going to bomb in, they are going to kill in, let alone getting to the stage of having a blank sheet of paper from Khalifa Haftar, who's going to give you a mission brief, a statement of intent, how he's going to use these game-changing weapons.
Well, the problems with the end-user certificates are well known for decades. But just to give you a view of what the situation is, look, Khalifa Haftar attacked Tripoli 10 days before a national conference sponsored by the United Nations. Its agenda was approved in Abu Dhabi 20 days before that. The Secretary General was in town, and Khalifa Haftar attacked. The Europeans on their own, the Europeans and the Americans and the Russians and the Chinese could not even tell Haftar, well, that wasn't nice. So let alone taking a stand or making a decision about transfer of weapons. So I think the problem is very big, and I am afraid that there is nothing that can be done about it right now.
It's not clearly a one-size-fits-all, Andrew, when it comes to the kind of embargoes that are deployed against specific countries. Would it be better, or would it be faster to stop this happening if the embargoes turned into an embargo and it was standardized? I mean, the embargo of which Egypt at the moment is the subject, it is the subject of an embargo, is weaker than other embargoes that are being applied around the Middle East. But then off the back of that, one's also got to say, well, if people are just ignoring or breaking the embargo, who cares whether it's weak or strong to start with?
The strength of embargoes often depends on other geopolitical considerations, and because a lot of large arms suppliers consider Egypt to be an ally, despite the utterly appalling human rights record of the regime there, then it's not a surprise that it's a significantly weaker embargo. But actually this comes down to that point of influence, which was raised a couple of questions ago, because actually the influence works both ways. It's not so much that if we're sitting around the table selling weapons to a despotic regime, we can try to influence them. Very often these regimes know that they're not just buying weapons, they're also buying political support. And crucially, they're also buying silence. And I expect that's a big consideration for the Saudi regime, for example, at the moment, who are understandably under a lot of international criticism because of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and because of the terrible war they have waged on Yemen. And so by buying weapons, they're also buying allies, they're also buying support. And I think that's played a crucial role in shaping the ever-changing message from the Trump administration about the murder of Khashoggi, and the ever-changing message of countries like the UK about the need for a peaceful solution in Yemen.
Lawrence, if there is to be a change in this legislation, if the embargoes are to be tightened, if the final use declarations are to be enforced properly, will that dynamic come not from the presidents and the prime ministers in the manufacturing countries, not in the selling countries, but from the voters? Because people will voice an opinion on this, perhaps at the ballot box.
Well, you hope so. Basically, maybe with a change of administrations, I know that the Obama administration, while they did sell things to them, they were very, careful about making sure they didn't end up in the wrong hands. But that's got to be, in other words, it has to be, I think, the leading arms manufacturers who have to recognize that the short-term gains that you might get from selling these things are far outweighed by the long-term problems that it's causing, as I mentioned, both strategically as well as morally. And I think that's what the United States has to get back, its moral position in the world, where it stands up for a lot of these things. Unfortunately, right now, we're letting arms control agreements expire. We're getting out of the POA with Iran. We getting at on August 2nd, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement. So we're just not doing what some previous administrations have done. And it's got to, in my view, the United States has got to take the lead because we're the world's leading arms exporter of arms around the world.
Gentlemen, we have to leave it there. Thanks to all our guests. They were Salah Al-Bakush, Andrew Smith and Lawrence Korb. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime on the website, aljazeera.com. And for more discussion, go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also tweet us. We're at AJ Inside Story. I'm at Peter Dobby1. From me, Peter Dobby, and the entire team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. I will see you very soon. Bye-bye.